What you're about to see is one of the most important videos that I have ever made. The future of the West, the future of any culture, depends on families, parents, and children, and how those children are raised. By raising our children to develop agency and counteracting the mind-numbing forces of mass media propaganda, Hollywood entertainment, and sick social pressures, we are creating a generation that cannot be manipulated or controlled by external forces. This video will help parents to understand how to raise children to develop age-appropriate levels of agency. Even if you don't have any children, you can gain a greater understanding of your own childhood and your potential struggles in adulthood with agency. Please enjoy this video, and a special thank you to Jonathan and Adriana Prescott for joining me. Hello, my name is Noah Ravoy, and I'm here today with John and Adriana, and we're talking about agency and how it relates to parenting. This is a very important topic, how parents demonstrate agency, how they teach their children agency. And just to start, I'm going to give a simple explanation of what agency is. Agency is the human capacity to identify opportunities and make choices that are consistent, correspondent, existentially possible, and coherent within reality. So essentially, it's your ability to impose your will on the world around you in a rational, logical, moral, and ethical way. Thank you, John and Adriana, for joining us today.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
So you guys have done some research and divided up the concept of how parents should teach agency and demonstrate agency to their children into 5 different sections. How would you like to introduce that?
Well, I could go down the line and...
Well, he defined agency. We have actually a psychological definition.
Yes.
You want to?
Yes, let's look at that. And the psychological definition, and there's actually several definitions, depending on, like, for neuroscience, there's one for sociology and the one for psychology. But agency, the degree to which an individual has an ability to make decisions about their life. To have agency means to have control, or the feeling of control, over your life and the decisions that you make. Basically, I'm free to make rational plans and decisions for my life, and I have the ability to control and direct the outcome of those decisions. And if I want to really put it very simply, can I do it? Can I own it? Therefore, I'm responsible for it.
Absolutely.
Okay.
And I like how you said to a degree, and I think this is very important to understand. It's not an issue of do you have or not have agency. It's where are you on the spectrum of agency, and are you sufficiently developed to meet the challenges that your life has? You know, a 5-year-old doesn't need much agency, but if you've got a 5-year-old, you need a lot of agency then to look after that child.
Sure. And so psychology actually divides those two things up. And there's actually 2 things in the definition. You have a sense of agency, and then you have a sense of ownership. Okay. So do I feel like I have the agency, and am I responsible for it? So they call them SA and SO for sense of agency, sense of ownership. But what's interesting is low agency is hallmarked by a disassociation or an ambiguity between ourselves and the things we do or have. The high agency implies that they make plans and carry out actions. In child development, low agency is commonly associated with an abusive environment. Okay, the harsher the environment, the lower the agency is developed. Operationally, low agency within an abusive household can be a survival mechanism, because you don't want to make waves if your caregiver is an abusive, oppressive individual. It's easier just to go along with them. The result is we're conditioned to just do what we're told, so we don't get a chance to practice agency. In fact, we basically are stripped of that developmental stage where we would normally practice agency, and then we're commanded to be responsible. But we can't be responsible if we've had no practice owning things and owning, ourselves and our decisions and stuff if we're just, done what we're told.
I just want to interject real quick. It's not just like an abusive environment, but an environment that's unpeaceful, where children are considered a second lower class, and they're also always under someone with authority, and they don't have a say about many things. They're being told what to do. So it's not necessarily just abusive, it's just more of a unpeaceful, not really being a part of like a valuable member of the family, where
Right.
they have their place too.
And we'll definitely get into that when we talk about peaceful parenting, which is absolutely key to generating agency within children. This is from a paper, Complex Trauma in Children and Adolescents. And one of the things that stood out to me is that in early caregiving relationships, provide the relational context in which children develop the earliest psychological representations of self, of other, of self in relation to other. These working models form the foundations of a child's development competencies, including distress tolerance, curiosity, a sense of agency, and communication. Now, this is amazing. When the child caregiver relationship is the source of trauma, the attachment relationship is severely compromised. 80% of maltreated children develop insecure attachment patterns when the primary caregiver is too preoccupied, distant, unpredictable, punitive, distressed to be reliably responsive. Children become distressed easily and do not learn to collaborate with others when their own internal resources are inadequate. Basically, we've just described a lot of the stressful parenting that is out there when, and so 80% of those are not developing enough agency.
And it's interesting because you've been talking about the peacefulness of the parenting, and some people say, some people believe that there's less spanking going on now than there was a couple generations ago. And they say, oh, look, you're raising snowflakes. What it really is the current generation of people have not had a chance to have engaging parents. Their parents didn't engage with them properly. And that is unpeaceful parenting as well, because you mentioned too preoccupied to have attention on the children. And
correct.
That's that has its own damages as well. It's not just a matter of hitting or not hitting. It's a cluster of behaviors, and you don't need to get it wrong on every one. You get it wrong on some of them, you're going to have that negative effect. We can see it in individual level. We can see it in a societal level. We look at the way that the Spartans treated their children. Basically, they treated them as tools of the state. They weren't treated as human beings. They didn't even really treat the adults as human beings either. Then we see the way that the Athenians treated their children, and they did a much better job. They were, in general, much more child-centric. Athens left us tremendous amounts of art, literature, philosophy, and thinking, and all we have from the Spartans are what other people wrote about them. They left us nothing. They contributed nothing to the future of Europe and the world. And so we really can see how treating your children differently leads to a very different outcome, not just as individuals, but even as society.
Sure.
Yeah, I think what people say, okay, it's I think that doing the spanking and all those other things is really a very lazy shortcut to basically the adult get what they want, right? And they think that by doing peaceful parenting, it switches to the child getting what they want, but it's not. It's actually still getting what we want, but we're teaching our child those skills to be independent, to be responsible, to have agency, to actually, and it's not a shortcut because it takes effort. It takes knowledge from the parent.
And also, if we are belonging to some sort of an organization or culture where submission is extremely important, where there is not a appreciation for individuality, then there will be a lot of pressure within that culture to physically discipline children. It will lead to a lot more spanking. It will lead to harshness with children because that suits the rulers of that kind of a society.
Yeah,
Sure.
They want immediate results. They want it spontaneous, immediate results now. And so that's the way to get it. But they don't realize that if you put in the time and the effort, that you get the results in the long term or a lot better.
Well, not only that, but they're incentivized to actually reduce the agency of the people around them, because if you can keep people's agency low, you can keep control over them. And there is a lot of people that they enjoy controlling other people, including their own children, and they'll attempt to exercise control over their children by consciously or subconsciously preventing them from developing agency.
Yeah. Well, it doesn't necessarily have to be an abusive situation. It just has to be a high stress. It's another thing that does not develop in a high stress environment, as far as, developmentally, is creativity and imagination. Right? If you're locked in a tiger's cage, you're not thinking about composing symphonies. You're thinking about survival. And so if your caregiver is somebody who stresses you out with even if they're just verbally abusive or demanding or irrational,
or smothering,
prone to smothering, fits of rage. They have their own problems with self-control. That can be a high stress environment. Not getting enough food is a high stress environment. But it's also true in the child's education. If you're not homeschooling, you're fighting the child's model of what is true, okay, what is good, and their creativity. Public school and some private is not about education. It's about stress compliance. It's about obedience training, right? They don't care if you learn. They really don't. They care if you obey. And that's always been that way, because the whole system is developed on the Prussian model of education. It's for turning out factory workers. It's training. It's not education. But this brings me to the next question I have.
Well, actually, not yet. I was going to check. Did you address the effects on the brain?
Oh,
that's really important. From being in either abusive or unpeaceful environment.
Oh yes, thank you for that. Sure. In child, and again, we know that an abusive environment affects brain development. We know that from many studies. The Romanian orphans from 1980s, Ceausescu, Romania, they followed those children through adulthood, and have seen that type of condition affects how the amygdala grows and stuff like this. But
I think, if I remember too, that one of the major effects of that didn't affect the brain all equally. Some parts were less affected than others, but one of the real impacts was on the control centers of the brain, which enable a person to have self-control, impulse inhibition, and also to make yourself do things when you don't perhaps want to at first. And yes, that's extremely important to agency.
Sure, and attachments. None of them have really had any solid attachments growing up. And even though they have a very loving adoptive family, because there's a lot of the children that were adopted in French couples. But anyway, it also specifically abusive environment affects the posterior parietal cortex, and that's responsible for self-recognition. Okay.
Yeah.
And so that's so basically what you have is you have a physical manifestation of stress and abuse that affects agency, that affects creativity. You have the education side, and that leads me to the next thing
Just before you go on to the next, you mentioned that it affects a person's ability for self-recognition, to recognize themselves or understand themselves. Is that what I'm understanding?
That's what that area of the brain is specifically for.
It's interesting because that's something that I specifically find in people that need help to direct their lives. Is very often they've either had to go through therapy in order to get an understanding of themselves, or they are still struggling to do that. And very often just helping them understand why they perhaps do some sort of a negative behavior, to understand why they react a certain way, to recognize their own impulses and reactions. I've been told by people, they said it's like a light bulb went on in my mind.
Sure.
And that is something that should be natural. And it's that what you're describing could be why that it's been inhibited, because there's generally a high stress childhood goes along with people who are in that position.
Yes.
Oh yeah. And typically what'll happen is people will self-medicate, and that's where you get the work of Dr. Gabor Mate, dealing with addictions and stuff like this. And that's a whole nother story altogether. But that is a fantastic thing. I encourage people to look into his work, the realm of hungry ghosts. But anyway. Where does the sense of agency coincide with motivation? Okay, and this is very interesting because there's been a lot of work in psychology on motivation.
What is motivation?
Right. What is motivation? There's basically two schools of thought. There's either the model of intrinsic versus extrinsic motivation, which is kind of like the Skinnerian B.S. Skinner, behaviorist style, Reese, not Kohlberg.
Oh, that's the moral.
Right. Anyway, come to me in a minute. But basically, Professor Stephen Reese in Ohio State University, he proposed 16 basic desires for the theory of motivation. And his is based on genetically distinct motives. And that's different than the intrinsic extrinsic. But yeah, and people can look into that, and it's a very interesting study in and of itself. But I say that there's only two desires that cover all of motivation, and that is the access of one's own imagination and creativity, and the ability to act on one's own imagination and creativity. If you look at any employment situation, right? Because one of the major problems in corporations, they're trying to get their employees to be motivated and engaged, and that's one of the biggest problems that they have, and so they can't keep them engaged. So what do? Well, you have to look at what fires their imagination and creativity, and you have to be able to give it to them. But even as children and adults, even the worst procrastinator will have a hobby and spend hours and hours on learning about it and working it, and their imagination is sparked, and so they have the ability to direct their agency, because it's the same exact model. All right, so you have agency, which is the ability to self-direct, right?
Being free.
And free to self-direct. And then you have creativity and imagination, which if you are able to have creativity and imagination and act on that, that's the same pathway as agency. But if you're in a stressful society, in a stressful and developmental situation, you're going to lose that. You're not going to be creative. And so not only do you lose agency, you lose your imagination.
And inherent in creativity is error, and generally an oppressive society is extremely punishing of error, to the point where it's not worth risking creativity because you might get an error which leads to death. This is why where societies where people are living bare sustenance, you don't find a lot of creativity. They just can't be creative because they can't risk the expenditure of the energy necessary and the resources necessary to be creative, because if they make a mistake, they die. And you can impose that artificially. This is why I think this is part of the reason some cultures have very little creativity. They will tend to imitate what their ancestors did. Japan was cut off for 400 years from the rest of the world, and they didn't change at all. Their art remained identical. Their technology remained the same. Even their government, everything that they did stayed the same for 400 years. And they only opened up when they were forced to. And then suddenly, when they were forced to open up, they were able to start to develop again creatively. And you can see this as on an individual level. If your parents punish you for mistakes, and more or less leave you alone, otherwise you just try to avoid making mistakes, keep your head down, and don't make a lot of noise.
Exactly. You have anything to add on that?
No, we're good.
Okay. So my third question is, where does a sense of agency transition to a sense of moral agency? Okay, because first we have agency, the can I do it? Can I own it? Right? But how does that transition to moral agency? And that's in the realm of philosophy. It's also in the realm of psychology. But and in things like Piaget's stages of the development, Erikson's stages of social development, there's a lot of great work in psychology for that. But one of the big ones that really is telling is Kohlberg's theory on moral development. So boys and girls differ in moral development. Boys will find justice, and girls will focus on fairness. Girls will typically say in an objection, "That's not fair." Boys will say, "That's not right." And there's an evolutionary biological reason why we see this. And so that's where Kohlberg comes in his moral development stages. And so and y'all can the audience can look this stuff up, and it's very good.
There's 6 stages. Basically.
There's six basic stages, and it's in the 3 levels. Your pre-moral level, which is children. You have a conventional level, then you have the principled level. So stage 1 and 2 is the pre-moral, where you're dealing with basic self-interest. If you disobey rules, blah, blah, blah. And then the stage 2, exchange of favors. You recognize other people have needs. And then you have stage 3, which is in the conventional level. And you make decisions based upon what pleases others, concerned about maintaining interpersonal relationships. And interestingly enough, what Kohlberg found was typically women kind of stagnate here, okay? But boys go on to stage 4 and 5 and 6. And 4, of course, is the stage of law and order, which they look to society as a whole for guidelines of behavior. Think of rules as inflexible and unchangeable. And stage 5 is recognizing the rules are social agreements that can be changed when necessary. And then, of course, stage 6 is adhere to a small number of abstract principles that transcend specific concrete rules in answer to inner consciousness. And this is where for daughters, agency is a very powerful tool, because one of the things that Kohlberg discovered on the girls' moral development, they stagnating, they did not progress to stage 4. One particular feminist contemporary of Kohlberg, Carol Gilligan, she didn't like that.
She didn't like the results.
Right?
She didn't feel. Maybe she didn't feel it was fair.
That's exactly right.
That's exactly what it was.
And in fact,
She was stuck there.
So she come up with her own thing, and basically said, well, men have a justice-based morality, and women have a care-based morality.
She made it sound better.
And so
Men are focused on reality, and women are focused on feelings. That's what she said, unintentionally.
But the thing is she took those 3 steps and divided it into 6, her own 6, because she couldn't really, refute what Kober found because he was very specific. And so, what does that mean regarding agency? Remember, in Koberg's stages, agency is the ability to make decisions and have control and ownership of those decisions. At its core, justice-based system of morality. This is the core. To be able to control the owner and have the ownership of decisions. Consequently, it is also the core of a K-selected population. Okay. The concept of agency implies that an active organism, one who desires and makes plans, carries out actions. Low agency is a hallmark by disassociation, ambiguity between ourselves and the things we've done. Low moral agency are selected. Care-based entities typically claim that their problems are not my fault.
So you can see the results now in males and females.
Sure.
Typically, males have more agency than females do because females rely so much on giving that up to someone else.
Now, of course, there's 2 systems we're dealing with. One is a justice-based system, and one is a care-based system, right? Now, evolutionary speaking, and in biology, men, if we're talking about chimpanzee troops, again, an idea of that, the men will protect the tribe. The men will go around the perimeter and look for dangers, and so they have to make right and wrong decisions. Women in the center of the group, and the same thing true for tribal situations and on chimpanzees and stuff. They look inward into interpersonal things and care and stuff like this. So it's necessary, right? I totally get it.
Well, and the female care-based, you have to, as a mother, you have to focus most attention on the least productive and least capable members of society, the tiny infants. And as children get older and more capable, you give them less resources because they're capable of getting their own resources. Whereas the men have it exactly the opposite. They're focused on training the more capable younger men as they're coming up in age to join them on those patrols and to be a useful member of the team. And so they have differing focuses, not exactly opposite, but differing focuses. And so, of course, they would have that differing development of what they consider to be right and wrong.
Sure. And that's basically how, I mean, it is what it is to be tautological. But the problem that we have, the dynamic that we have, is men have a higher propensity for agency.
They have more practice.
And therefore the justice-based system of morality than women do in aggregate. If you wanted to talk about just the justice-based system, men are more moral than women. Okay. Now, again, this is an aggregate. We can think of plenty of examples, go into the not all argument. But the thing is, but if you're not raised in a proper environment, you're not going to have agency, and so you're on the other side of the bell curve on that. But anyway,
well, if you are raised improperly and you're a woman, you're going to be more affected by both genetics and environment. Whereas if you're a man, you will have at least some genetics pushing you a little bit towards agency, even though you'll be on the wrong side of the agency bell curve for men. It won't have the same impact. Generally, when genetics and environment line up with each other, the impact is exponentially more than when it's just one or the other. So it really has a much more serious impact on women. And we can see that today with more than half of women are on psychotropic drugs, drugs that alter their brain chemistry. And no doubt a lot of that is because if you do not have agency, you keep hurting yourself. And so you take drugs to no longer feel that pain. And if they're prescription drugs or they're illegal drugs, it doesn't matter if you're taking them because you have problems you won't deal with, then it's giving the same effect. Women are less happy now in many ways than they were 2 or 3 generations ago.
Mm-hmm. So you wanted to go into.
Well, let me talk about the reality that we're living now. Is that in an ideal, perfect world, the husband is at home all the time, right? And has this a more of a presence and can pretty much teach agency to everybody. But the reality is males are at work most of the day. And so the females are at home with the kids. So we can't teach agency unless we have it ourselves.
Sure.
So most women having not much agency, we're not breaking that cycle. So I think women need to step it up quite a bit and build more agency, more ownership. It's not that we're stepping into husband's toes or anything. It's because our husband is not here.
Right.
So that becomes our responsibility because now we're in front of the children.
And we had a conversation. About alphas and betas earlier, and about agency, and about if a woman appears to be helpless, she's not going to attract an alpha. She's going to attract a white knight beta.
Yep.
Okay. But because the alpha is going to say she's a liability.
Yeah.
I don't want to breed helplessness into my genetic line. I want to breed high agency into my line. I want my sons to have high agency, and I want my daughters to attract men with high agency. Therefore, I'm going to seek a high agency mate.
So basically, the chivalrous code is kind of for betas.
And maybe that's because women are stuck on that stage, which maybe that also affects their maturity level. They're stuck on that stage, and so they can't really assess properly and say, I like this prince to sweep me off my feet and make me swoon or whatever, but they don't realize that person is not going to give them a high success of a good marriage.
That yes, they're feigning helplessness.
They're living a fantasy world. So.
But you want to start going into the section 4 about how to set the environment to teach agency. What we did.
Well, we do peaceful parenting. What do you want to say about that?
Well, yes. Well,
what's the difference between peaceful parenting and, there was a lot of people, I was getting this argument recently that today so many people are doing what they call peaceful parenting, and their children are turning out terrible. They're completely out of control. And they're saying, back in my day, we all hit our kids, blah, 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 and they turned out fine. I think it's important when we start a conversation with peaceful parenting and we have a wide audience to really mention what that is and how that differs perhaps from some of the wrong ideas about peaceful parenting.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, what are some of the wrong ideas that you've heard?
Well, very often what they're doing is they're conflating unparenting, which means you basically have, small people living in your house, but otherwise you ignore them, and peaceful parenting, where you are parenting, but you are also not using violent methods, and you are not giving the children a sense of insecurity. And I'm trying to give it the broadest description possible. I think part of the problem is really that unparenting concept. It's it's neglect. Unparenting is neglectful. Peaceful parenting is not neglectful. You do not neglect the training of your children. What you do is you do it in a peaceful way. You train them in a peaceful way. You teach them in a peaceful way.
Exactly.
So here's the thing. Peaceful parenting, the parents must practice self-knowledge. They have to know themselves. They have to know where their disconnects are with their own past and their dysfunction.
Fix it.
And fix that, work on that, because we all have triggers. We didn't install the buttons, someone else did, right? We have to uninstall or disconnect those stress buttons. I use this as an example.
Have to be peaceful with ourselves before we can be peaceful with our children. You know, we all have that inner child in us. It's what helps us to be creative and, you know, to be, you know, comedic and funny and interact with other people. I think that inner child's very useful for that. But we also have an inner parent. And if the inner parent is unpeaceful to us, so when we make mistakes, that inner parent is harsh and demanding and demeaning to us, we're telling ourselves that we're valueless, or that when we make a mistake, we've done the worst thing ever. We're not treating ourselves peacefully. We're not going to be capable of treating our children peacefully. It'll be impossible.
Yes, absolutely. And I use this as an example in the past and several times. Is I remember I was sitting in my chair, and my daughter comes in the room, and she was probably about 4, and she's singing away. She's happy, and all of a sudden I feel this sense of, you know, I want to say, be quiet, and I'd stop myself. And I said, where is that coming from? Why do I feel anxiety when she's singing? She's not doing anything wrong, right? She is just being happy. Why would I tell her to be quiet? And I realized that when I was growing up, I was not allowed to be loud in the house. And so my inner parent was saying, the inner parent and my protector as a father were fighting. And I was saying, I have to protect my daughter from my inner parent, because my inner parent was going to yell at her. And my protective side said, no, she's good. And so, so that's the best example I can give for practicing self-knowledge. Know where it comes from. And so I said, what are you singing? And she told me as I was singing, blah, blah, blah. I was like, oh, I want to hear some more. So she was even more happy that she had an audience. That's peaceful parenting. But
and I think if you want to know more about the details of peaceful parenting and how it's better than non-peaceful parenting than other forms of parenting, Stefan Molyneux did a great series called The Bomb in the Brain, and yes, you can look that up. It's on his channel. I think all the videos are still there, and that is your education. If you're a parent and you haven't watched that, you need to go and watch that after this video. I think every parent needs to see it.
I think the biggest thing is not taking the abusive aspect out of raising your children, but also be an active and engaging person to your children.
Right.
It's actually being there with them, being a guide, being a mentor, teaching them how to be this fantastic individual when they grow up. And they're not going to have those skills unless you teach them those skills. And you have to have them yourself, right? If you're not, I think the biggest thing that I see is how many parents actually lack patience. They're so impatient. They're so used to being conditioned to have these results right away. And it doesn't happen like that. If you
most of the time when my son is misbehaving somehow, it's either he has an unmet need, or I haven't taught him how to deal with the situation that he's in yet. And once he learns to deal or has his need met, and, you know, you could say, well, you know, he should tell you if he needs something, but they're children. They don't do that. Adults often have a hard time communicating their needs, children even more so.
Yes.
When he's misbehaving, I'll usually bring him close and say to him, you know, how are you, what are you feeling? Why are you doing that? Is there something that you need? Are you hungry? Are you thirsty? Are you tired? Is something I'm doing irritating you before and you're trying to get back at me? Because, you know, kids will do that. They haven't learned any social graces when they're born. They have to learn that over time. And especially boys will tend to take out their frustrations physically, and girls will tend to take it out emotionally. But they will strike back if they don't feel comfortable. And you as a parent have to learn to interpret that. It's not just babies that do a lot of nonverbal communication. Right. You know, kids will do that right up to teenagers.
Absolutely. And that's why it's imperative we need to think in terms of skill sets. Understand that you're dealing with an untrained human being. Mm-hmm. Okay? And we're the trainers. We have to model every aspect of the behavior we want to see.
Correct.
Okay? If we're not doing it, they're not going to pick it up. In fact, they're going to pick up the worst part, because when they see, when there's tiny brains that are being formed for survival, they see you as a successful model because you've lived, you know, until your adulthood.
Long enough to have them, at least.
Correct. So whatever behavior, that's what they're going to focus on.
Yes, and unfortunately, some of that is subconscious, so that the people are not even aware that they have these issues. And we actually addressed a little bit of that on our video we did on how to raise a genuine child.
Yes.
In our Peaceful Montessori homeschool. And we talk about how kids will mirror everything, the good and the bad. So you have to be self-aware of yourself and fix the bad things that you don't want your kids to pick up. So.
Also, you're going to be misunderstood.
Oh, yes.
Okay. Communication. Children have very, very concrete ideas on good and bad. And I taught my daughter a little bit about philosophy when she was 4, and because we're started going through table manners. And I said, it doesn't make you a bad person if you don't know how to hold your fork. There's a good person can have bad manners, mm-hmm. and a bad person can have good manners. Mm-hmm. And I told her there's two words for that. One is ethics and one is aesthetics. And so I was giving her a little introduction just on that, just dealing with manners versus being good or bad. Because to a child, good is good, bad is bad, and it's very concrete.
Yeah, it's been difficult for my son to understand that certain people who are bad sometimes do good things. And certain people who are good sometimes do a bad thing, mm-hmm. and then have to you know, and he, you know, where do bad people come from? Oh, you know, originally he thought, well, if you have bad parents, then you have bad kids, and it's like some sort of a different type of human being, and good is another type of human being. And he's starting to understand that, you know, the actual causes, what is good and bad, and how behavior can shift. If you ask him now, what makes you bad? He says, because you choose to be bad. So he's getting the understanding that agency is involved in choosing what kind of a person you are. You know, you can't display agency if you don't know there is such a thing, or if you don't know it's possible to display agency. And you know, talking with your kids about these things is very important. This is, instead of beating your kids into submission so that they follow the rules that you've given them, mm-hmm. you are training them to understand how to follow the world when there is no rules. Very often, there are no clear rules, mm-hmm. you know, or we have conflicting rules because we have conflicts of culture. How do you behave in those situations?
Oh, yeah. Mm-hmm. And I'm glad you mentioned that, because when I told my daughter, I says, you know, if we don't need a rule that says don't eat broken glass. Okay, because we know intuitively that that's a bad thing. All right, so the state of the only reason why we need rules is so that it may not be clear to us that something may be good or bad. Now, once we practice, I mean, I personally don't need a rule to tell me to go brush my teeth every night. All right, because it's internalized. So I don't need somebody to give me a rule. And for children, we create with myself, my wife, and our daughter, we all agree on rules, and the rules apply to everyone. And so a lot of times when we deal with a behavioral issue, we say, do you think we need to make a rule? I mean, are we good to try to learn this lesson on our own? And so sometimes we make a rule and we talk about it and agree to it. And so everybody is on board with it. And so that's part of peaceful parenting. And so the children need to learn the rules of the game. All right, how to interact with people, what's expected of them, what to expect. If you want to if you are having trouble when you take your kids out to the grocery store and they get antsy and misbehave and stuff like this, well, first tell them what to expect. We have to go to the store. It's going to take this long. It's going to be boring. You prepare them. You explain to them. Let them know what to expect. I mean, think about.
Okay, get them to agree. Is this okay? Can we do that? I need to do this. Is it okay if you come with me and do this with me?
Right.
You kind of make sure that they are okay with that.
Because once you get their buy-in,
yeah,
then you can say, you did agree that this is the thing, okay? And if you want to change the rule, change the agreement, we can talk about it. But usually, if they agree, you're golden.
Yep.
Is there
I took my son to boxing class, and halfway through he says, "I'm done. I'm starving. I need to go home," because he didn't eat his lunch. And I said to him, "Well, you agreed to come here and stay for a whole hour." And he says, "Okay, when is the hour? Show me on the watch." So I said, "Okay, it's when the hand is over here, it's the hour." And then every 5 minutes or so, he'd say, "Hey, how close are we?" And I'd just show it to him again. And when he recognized that he had made an agreement for it and that he had that there would be an end to it, then he was fine. A lot of times the problem is we expect our kids to go with us places. They have no idea what's happening. When will it end? Maybe it never ends. The other time when I cried, eventually I went home. So maybe I just need to cry harder and I'll get to go home or whatever. And we are often maltraining our children. We're actually training them contrary to the thing that we want them to do, because we're not communicating or explaining anything to them. And we're, as was mentioned earlier, I think Adriana mentioned this, we're not treating them like human beings, like useful members of the family. We're treating them like accessories. And if we do that, then we're not going to get a good result.
And much worse, sometimes, depending on the culture, they treat kids like another pet. They're being fed, they're being put to sleep, but other than that, there's no interaction.
Or the interaction is only at the parent's pleasure. Oh, I want to play with my kid, I will. The kid needs something? No, it's not good for me right now.
But the peaceful parenting is, a lot of it is the communication aspect. A lot of time is invested in communicating with your child.
So anyway,
on the communication, how important it is that you have to invest a lot of time, and it can take, you can have something planned to go somewhere, but something happens, a misunderstanding or whatever, and you may have to cancel the one thing, because then you have to really have that conversation with your kid. You have to have that communication, sort out the misunderstanding and the disagreement, and that happens a lot. That's part of you developing independence in them, so that they know how to sort their own emotions, sort their own understanding of the world.
And that is also agency. We are
Exactly.
modeling that agency, because if we get a pass for breaking a deal,
Mhm.
okay, that's not showing them agency. But if we say, I'm sorry, I really, this happened, I'm gonna have to break the deal. How
Mhm.
can I make it up to you? Because once we model that, they will do it back to us.
Exactly.
And that because there's another side of things. Because then you can say, it's like lying. You never lie to your kids,
Mhm.
and you can always say, have I ever lied to you? No. Then you don't have to lie to me. And that is a very, very powerful tool. So
Well, and if we don't punish them harshly, they don't have a fear of telling us the truth either, and that makes it a lot easier because they're not fearing a reaction. I'm more disappointed by the lie than I am by the actual action that happened, because he'll say, "Oh, I accidentally broke this thing." Usually, he comes to me with no problem. Once in a while, he will be, if he broke the same thing twice or three times, I think it's embarrassment, and he won't tell me what happened. And I will ask him and I'll explain to him, I'm more concerned. You're a kid, you're going to make mistakes. That's okay. But the lying is a choice. Mistakes are mistakes, but the lying, you made a choice, and that's not a good choice. And I will explain that to him so that he understands that, truth is more important than, and he gets quite upset when he knows someone else lied. It really bothers his sense of justice. And we want to encourage that. We want to encourage an intolerance for lies in our children, not just their own lies, but lies of others and societal as well.
absolutely.
Mhm.
And another thing to keep in mind when you're having conversations is, we're 3 to 4 times the size of the children. We can be very intimidating
Mhm.
in voice, in size, and stuff like this. And we have to be cognizant about how we're being viewed, because even though you may be saying something peaceful, or maybe you're saying something a little more direct with a different tone, they can still be kind of intimidated. And so
You have to come down to a level that appeals to them,
of course.
you know?
And so anyway, that's another aspect of it.
I think the last part about the communication too is that most people are nowhere near as good at communicating as they think they are.
Yes.
And a lot of couples don't do any real communication, for example.
Oh, yes.
I remember doing corporate communication training. I did corporate communication training for years, and I would do activities with people where they had to describe something to their coworker, and the coworker had to build it out of Lego. And it was we're talking maybe with 6 or 7 pieces of Lego. There's only a few positions you can place them in, so just by luck you almost get it right. And it was very difficult for people. They had to come up with an entire code of how they would communicate things. And I think that's part of what's important with children as well, is to come up with a method. How do you communicate with them? What are the method that you use to get your ideas across to your child? Are you using consistent wording? Are you making sure they understand the words you're using? Are you making sure that they feel comfortable to ask you if they don't understand something? Can they repeat it back to you and explain it to you?
Mhm.
And if not, a lot of people will they'll tell the kid something once and then they resort to hitting. And it's probably your own fault for not communicating well to begin with, why the kid didn't understand. And the hitting, all he understands is that if I don't guess the right thing on the first try, I'm going to get hit. So they'll just try to avoid you.
Not only that, but it's okay to hit to exert your frustration.
Yeah.
It doesn't make sense.
And
Yeah.
so
Which will come back to haunt you when you're a senior citizen, and you either get ignored and left alone in a home, or you get their frustrations taken out on you. So
Correct.
it's the way you parent your children is how they're going to treat you when you're old.
and it's also true, that's very true. You have to listen intently to your children when they're trying to explain something, because you want to be heard as well. So if you practice, and again, this is all part of peaceful parenting.
Mhm.
This is all part of of learning agency, and about owning and being responsible for what you do. If you listen, they will listen. Because you can say, I always listen to you. You always have a voice here. Okay, I want to know what you think about things. All right. And if that's true and lived, they will open up to you, and they will learn those skills, and they'll pass them down to their children. And a lot of the cycle of abuse and the things will pass away. Because
well, this could be why so many people today are, I need to have a voice. I need to be heard. And as children, they were never heard. And now they get this pathological need for everyone to listen to them because they were never listened to as children.
Correct.
That's true. That's very good.
Do you want to talk about what we did, some of the specifics with what we did with Annabelle?
Oh, yeah.
For agency, I guess.
Sure. One of the first things that we did is teaching her about property. This goes along with peaceful parenting as well. But if we gave her a gift, it was hers. We could not take it away from her. Okay, because it's hers. Because if you take it away, all that means is that an authority can take things away from you. And if you want your children to open up to you, do you think they're going to tell you what their favorite toy is if it's subject to being confiscated? Okay, so I remember in one case, she has a doll, right? And we came in and Adriana said she colored on the doll's face.
Yeah, she added makeup to the doll with markers.
And Adriana was like, she was struggling with her own.
My inner stress was like,
how do I say that? So she came to me and says, what do we do? And I said, well, we ask her about it and say, how do you like it? Do you like the dolls better this way? Well, did
it turn out the way you expected?
Did you turn out the way expected? Okay, and that was a very good conversation that we had with her, because eventually she said, yeah, I'm not really fond of it, and I wish it would. I didn't do it.
Yeah.
She discovered on herself, and she was like, what was she, 5?
Yeah.
And so and I didn't have to say you did a bad thing. She discovered on her own.
Or the normal thing, you didn't treat your things well, which in their perspective, they could be treating it well, right?
That's right.
Or even that, it is an experiment. She wanted to experiment. Maybe in the future she will think her experiment through before she does it.
Yes.
Yes. And so when we honor and we respect her property, she's going to respect our property, because we have a room, we have a couch, we have different things, and we can expect, say, don't use markers on our couch because it could damage the couch. This is our couch. This is a family couch. So, but the things that are yours are yours. Things that are ours, and you have to ask. So we have a basis of what we're saying in the rules, because the rules apply to her as well. And so that's teaching them about property and property rights.
Already talked about the rule making.
Yes, we talked about the rule making.
She's included in the making of the rules.
And if something is already working, we don't need to make extra rules about things. We don't need to make arbitrary rules.
I've often told parents, fairly often, every few weeks, I have parents ask me, what kind of rules do you have in your family? How do you set up the rules and whatnot? And they want essentially a pre-made list of rules that I can give them for their family. And this focus on how many rules can I make, I say to them, if you can't handwrite it on a single sheet of paper, you've got too many rules for your family. You guys got to figure out how to combine some of these or internalize them into principles. And I've been to people's houses where they had 50, 60 rules written on a chalkboard or a whiteboard in the area, and they were super specific, and most of them could have been clean up after yourself. If you just replace them all with that rule, you'd be fine. And it's if your children are having a hard time internalizing these things, it's very often because the parents aren't doing it. You know, parents who say you need to clean up after yourself, but then don't clean up after themselves, or don't teach the children what that means. When I was teaching my son, you know, the foundations of agency start with Seymour Papert, talked about this under the constructivism type of methodology, where you can't learn something that's unconnected to what you know. Well, children know almost nothing. So everything you teach them, you have to connect it to what they do know. When I first taught my son how to pick up after himself, what did he know? He knew come here. He knew stand in this place. He knew look at me. He knew these basic commands. So I'd bring him to me, have him stand in front of me, look at me, and I'll say, okay, we're going to do cleanup. He didn't know what cleanup meant. You can't tell your kid to clean up when they don't know. And I would say to him, this is how it works. First, we're going to look for stuff that's not in its place. See, there's a toy. Pick up the toy. Picks up the toy. He doesn't know what to do next. Walk over to the box where all your toys go. Okay, open the box, put the toy in, now close the box. You just tidied that toy up. Now let's try to do that with more toys. And I would have to tell him for maybe 10 or 15 times that step by step. Every time we'd go back for the next few weeks, the very first toy, I'd remind him how to do it. And after that, he had the process. Now it's internalized. I just say, go clean up your toys. And half an hour later, his toys are cleaned up. And a lot of parents, they're still struggling with this level of training at teenage years, because the kid may not really understand what it is, or the parents aren't setting a good example, or a combination. So it's amazing how incremental the training has to be when they're little. Very incremental.
And that's a very good point, because you have to teach them, you have to train them exactly what a task in all the steps. Okay, because
I call it programming. It's like programming. You're programming them to be able to do things so that with only a word or two, you can trigger all of the programming you put in before for them to do some sort of a task that they need to do.
Right. They don't have the neurons attached yet. You have to create them. You have to mold the human mind, and that's parenting.
Yeah, and curious enough, the cleaning aspect or straightening up aspect is actually already a stressful thing for adults. So they're passing on that stress over.
That's right.
They haven't really sorted that out yet within themselves.
You tell a 6-year-old, make your bed. They don't know how to do it. You know?
Even those words, they don't make sense. Make your bed? My bed's already made. It's right there.
Yeah.
It doesn't. It's a different way of using the words than what they're used to. You know, my wife's mother, when she would clean, she would grumble under her breath and have a terrible look on her face, and she was angry the whole time she would clean. When my wife hears the sound of a vacuum cleaner, she immediately feels anxiety.
Yes.
And it's that programming from childhood. And if you want to unprogram, she's mostly over it now. If you want to unprogram yourself, you got to look down into the roots of what subroutines there are causing me stress. It may not be the actual thing. It might be somewhere down there. There's some subroutines. And we talked about agency being your ability to look into yourself and figure out your motivations and why you're doing things. And that's really a big part of it. And when you're programming your children, when you're training them, you got to be really careful to do it with reinforce the fact that cleaning can be pleasurable. You know, kind of like the Maria Kondo type thing. You know, you watch that show a little bit and suddenly you feel happy about cleaning your room.
Not like a Jordan Peterson thing.
Yeah. Clean your room up and it's got to hurt and you got to suffer. And while you're doing it, self-flagellate a bit.
Suffering's good.
Yeah.
Just take it.
Life is supposed to be, my life is miserable, therefore life is supposed to be miserable. And this is another problem that parents will tend to do. You know, if they had terrible childhoods, if they had dysfunctional or dysfunctional adulthood as well, they will tend to insist that their children have as little pleasure in life as they did and as much suffering. And what ends up happening is your children are suffering and they're not even sure why.
Yeah.
My mother-in-law, she had to basically do all of the house cleaning when she was a child, and this is why she missed out on part of her childhood because of that, and that's why she had that anxiety around it. My wife has anxiety because she passed that on to her from it. So my wife is suffering from her mother's childhood.
Yes.
There are people suffering from the childhood of an ancestor so long ago that nobody remembers their name, and they're still suffering the trauma that ancestor went through now because it gets passed on every generation. We have to be really careful, not just that we train them, but that we train them with the right attitude, and that we train them to have the right framing to the things that they're doing.
And, you know, it's interesting because that stress response actually not only is passed on generationally by the behavior, is passed on generationally epigenetically, because you're being more and more susceptible to certain stimuli. And this is absolutely true when they discovered in studies of ants' behavior, of birds, of even humans, where genetic traits, behavioral traits are passed on epigenetically. So that's another whole story altogether.
So this is why we say self-work is incredibly important.
Yes.
You can't skip it.
And this is why peaceful parenting matters, because what you're doing is you're breaking the cycle and you're changing the destinies of your children, your grandchildren, their, all the way down the line. If you do those things, Dr. Lloyd DeMoss wrote a book. He's a psychohistorian. Talked about the origins of war and child abuse, and that's a fantastic read. It's free online on YouTube, and so it's an amazing eye opener about how. Anyway, well, the origins of war.
Oh, and how trauma is intergenerationally passed on as well, and how it affects in individual trauma creates the group trauma of war. You know, one of the arguments that I hear people say against peaceful parenting is that adult life can be very stressful, and that if children are not exposed to stress, they aren't going to develop the ability to deal with the cortisol response and other things of adulthood. And the way I usually answer that is I say, you know, my son's life should not be stressful, but he can have stress in the life. So there will be times I will take him to the gym, and you know, we will do some activity that's stressful. When I was a kid, I would go canoeing. My life as a child was very stressful, but you can take your kid, for example, canoeing and go on a slightly wild river, you know, appropriate to their age, but where they feel a bit of danger. Even when people toss the baby up in the air a little bit, what they're doing is they're giving that kid a little stress spike, so that their cortisol system, their system learns to deal with cortisol, with floods of it, but it's not an all day, everyday thing. Chronic stress is, most children live in chronic stress. They're constantly stressed out. They're it's very often that they're not relaxed at all at any point in the day. And that is extremely damaging to our ability to deal with stress as an adult. I think you mentioned earlier that an inability to deal with stressful situations as an adult is a result of that chronic childhood stress.
Sure.
The way we explain it to our daughter is there's good stress and bad stress. I mean, she had her Taekwondo belt test yesterday, and she was a little stressed about that, but she handled it great. She practiced extra, you know, she did what she needed to do, and she did great on her test.
Yeah, now she's a green belt.
Yep. So there's a difference. I mean, it's like there's going to be good stresses where you want to achieve certain very challenging goals, and you have to be able to know how to deal with those. But you don't need any of that bad stress, the trauma type, you know.
The bad stress.
Even the stress of knowing how to deal with difficult people, which you'll have to do sometimes as an adult. I think a lot of adults are excessively tolerant with bad behavior of other adults in their life. And, people say, well, you'll never be able to tolerate stressful, horrible people when you're an adult. And it's like, no, I don't want to tolerate them. I want them out of my life.
Exactly. You want to stay away from those toxic people.
Yeah. I don't want to learn to tolerate them. No. I want to be intolerant of them.
How are you supposed to survive poison if you don't drink poison?
Yeah. I think if you don't have cholera, how are you ever going to learn how to deal with having cholera? I think I'll just drink clean water. Thank you. I'd prefer that. It is that understanding of stress, the difference between positive and negative stress is important too, because as parents, especially as the father, we need to teach our children how to deal with that stress. So before your child had that, the Taekwondo classes, you probably were both preparing her. This is what you're going to go through. This is the kind of actions you need to take to deal with it. And then, it's going to be stressful. I trained kids to do robotics competitions, and the whole point was to put them under a day of intense stress. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And that way, but after time of preparation. So they would prepare, they would go a day of intense stress, and then they would when the stress was over, they were almost high. They were euphoric from all of the joy that they got from having accomplished something that was stressful and having pushed through that to make an accomplishment. And that's the way you train the cortisol response in a healthy way to react. The kind of stress that children get from a traumatic childhood is a stress with no positive reinforcement at the end of it for getting through the stress.
Exactly.
If you're in a situation and you are the caregiver, you're the parent, do you want a relationship that is based upon you stressing out that person?
Yeah.
Okay. That's not called even a friend, right? Mm-hmm. It's like, well, it's like even spanking.
It's like a type of bully instead.
It is. You're being a bully.
Yeah.
And I'm not going to do that. Mm-hmm. It's like, if you have a friend, you're not going to keep the friend very long if you hit them.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. You're not going to keep the friend. And you know what? When we get old and feeble, we want our children to want to be around us, right? And so that's why we treat our children good now, because it builds that relationship, and so that we have a lifelong relationship, because once they leave the house, that relationship changes. Okay, it's different. It's still it's no longer a child, it's an adult child. All right. And they are, now it's the dynamic of an adult to an adult. But there's still that relationship, and you don't want that child to say, I don't want anything to do with that evil person, the one who caused me all that stress. Right? I can't deal with it. And so that's, if people want to be that way, that's what they're going to inherit.
Mm-hmm.
And they may even have children that are simply completely dysfunctional. And I know a lot of cases of this where really the children never grow up. They're completely dysfunctional late into adulthood, and the parents end up regretting, often they will not take full agency over what they did to put the kid in that situation. But it's extremely rare that I see a young man or young woman with failure to launch, they hit 30 and they haven't got a fully developed life, where I don't see severe neglect on the part of the parents. There's definitely, I never see them go, my childhood was perfect. And then, after some scrutiny, continuing to believe that, and yet they have a failure to launch. We're faced with a wave of what, some people are calling incels. It's young men who have not completely grown up yet. They've grown up physically, but they're stalled out somewhere between a teenager and a full-on adult. And they're unable to reach the next steps of, wife and children and that kind of a life. And that often they want that. They're unable to do it. And this is because somewhere along the line, their parents didn't teach them the agency and the skills they need in order to complete the project of their life. And it's a huge challenge. If your parents didn't teach you, though, you need to learn it on your own. You need to go and find sources where you can learn agency on your own.
So yeah, that's pretty much wraps up what we have.
Well, we gotta finish a few more things on what we did. We taught our daughter about property. We included her in the rulemaking, and we talked about, we have to talk about incentives.
Okay.
Yeah, how we did that.
Well, yes, because
it's not gonna motivate for long term.
Remember, when I talked about motivation, it's about imagination and creativity, right? That's the only real motivator that we have. But when you have to be able to.
You can't rely fully on reward system.
Correct. What I was going to say is, you have to instill that desire, and desire is only discovered when you show them what's available to them, right? One of the things our daughter wants to do is she wants to go to Japan as an exchange student, okay? And one of the things that we explained to her is on how to get there. She's going to need XYZ. She's going to need some funds. She needs some money. And so we say, okay, there's some things that we can do around the house to help you generate income for your trip. And so those are rewards, and we can pay her for those things. However, there's a point, even as adults, where you can't pay me enough money to go do that job, right? And children have the same exact thing. And I remember at a conversation recently, our daughter's room was a mess, and so we started asking her questions about, well, would you do it for $5? No, I wouldn't want to do. I don't know how to do it. I was like, well, what if it was 10? I'm not saying I'm offering 10. What if it was $10? No. Well, what if mommy helped you for $10? And I started bumping it up. Finally, I got it up to $40. And I was ready to pay it if she was going to agree to it. Because if I got her to agree to something, then we can negotiate, right? And so, but the thing is that dream, that desire of having $40, because then her mind started working about what can I do with $40, right? And so, because that's like a month's allowance for me, because we give her half of our allowance is interesting, because we give her $20 and then $20 in silver bullion. That's a whole nother story altogether.
That's her part of her investment for the
Yes,
future.
that's her silver investment. Anyway, but so she's like, her mind started working, imagination. And so that built a desire and a motivation, because she started thinking about that $40. And she says, well, can I get it like the $20 and then I'll get the $40 in this, and I'll get another bar of silver. And so she started, and so I knew I had her then, because I had that imagination going. And so we had a good conversation. It turned out that she was willing. What do we do for that? It all did clean the room.
Yeah, but it wasn't that in the time frame.
Right. Yeah.
It was like we said, like it was an opportunity for right there and then.
Right. She did start. But she didn't finish. And I said, that's really too bad. And did we give her any money for the little effort that she did? Okay, so we did do that. But the thing about it is there was consequences, and I said, it's okay. It's okay if you didn't finish. because basically I wanted to see. I told her, I says I wanted to see what it would take.
Mm-hmm.
And I says, what did you learn? Did you have struggles here? Yeah, I had struggles here, and this was kind of hard. And we went over the whole thing. And instead of being, this is bad, you failed in this. Well, no, we took it apart and says, okay, what worked for you? What didn't work for you?
We had a conversation about it.
Right. And so
Mm-hmm.
that is a fantastic way.
And it lets her also to realize what her limitations are.
It realizes her limitations and also examining herself.
And the things that she needs to work on.
Correct.
Mm-hmm.
Well, and she'll develop a Pavlovian response to cleaning. When she cleans up, she will recognize, see, when you're an adult and you clean your house, you get this reward of, oh, my house looks nice. I feel proud of myself. I can have people over. When you're a kid, it kind of doesn't matter so much because, it's not really mine. It's mine, but it's not mine, and so you have a lower level of reward for that. There's so many interesting things you can do as a kid. Why would you be spending your time cleaning your room?
Their desire is all about them wanting to play.
And there's nothing wrong with play.
They're just kids.
No. Well, my son the other day, he had a particularly large mess that he'd made, and he wanted to have a friend over. And I said to him, you can't have your friend over with this amount of mess. We got to clean it up. And that was the first time. All I did was tell him that, and he went and cleaned it all. I wasn't actually thinking he was cleaning. I was finishing some work up, and I was going to go later and try to work with him to get it clean. And then I came later, it was already done because he wanted to have his friend over.
And his imagination and creativity was firing off in full cylinders because he was thinking, oh, my friend and I are going to play with this and we're going to do this. And so that was the motivation. So,
and even understanding consequences, every once in a while he'll step on a piece of Lego and he'll hurt his foot. And I'll say, I bet you that wouldn't happen if you put all your Lego away. And he'll put all of his Lego away, or at least move it out of the main walking area in front of him. And very often he'll clean it up. He'll clean it up because it often is at the side when he steps on it. And when he goes around a corner, he'll come around the corner and step on a piece he wasn't expecting. So explaining to him, because he'll get angry at the piece, and I'll say, it's not the piece's fault. Whose fault is it? And he'll say, well, I guess it's mine because I left it there. Yeah. So it's a matter of, this is why when I talk to people about developing agency, we talk about the idea of programming. You're programming yourself to have a thought process that I do this, I get this result. And it eventually becomes so well, we do this with children, becomes so well internalized, we can even do this with ourselves. And it becomes sufficiently internalized that we can accomplish anything we want. And we can accomplish many of our habits sort of on autopilot. We don't have to think deeply about taking a shower in the morning. If we had to think deeply about everything we did, we'd never get anywhere in life. No. It is good every once in a while to take simple things like, what are we eating? And how are we eating? Are we eating calmly and peacefully in a healthy way? And think deeply about them. And maybe we see there needs to be a change and we reprogram ourselves how we are reacting to food. But we don't need to do that every single day. We need to make these subroutines so that we can think about the big creative challenges of life. And whether you're programming yourself or programming your children to be able to do these, mundane tasks, it is a very interesting process, and how agency is connected with our ability to change our own programming and to have that programming there so that we're not under the control of someone else. Basically either we program ourselves or someone else programs us. That's true. Part of the reason we want to go with our children and say to them the step-by-step for things is we're teaching them how to teach themselves things. When my son wants to do something, I'll very often, he says, I want to build a castle. Well, what would you like in your castle? So I go step by step, all the process of brainstorming what should be in the castle, designing how the castle should look. What are all the things that would be in the castle? What would you what would you build first? You know, how tall would you want it? How many people would you want to be in there? And going through this thought process with him, it's not just about the end result. It's about teaching our children how to think and teaching them how to manage their lives.
Right. It's instead of basically, you know, people tell children, it's like, you have to dream dreams. No, you have to have a freaking plan, right? It's like, I don't want to dream because I have to wake up from the damn thing. I need to plan. I need to have goals and things that I want to accomplish, right?
Real things.
Real things, things that have connection to reality. Or else they're useless. They're fantasy.
And that have some significance to you as well. A big part of the reason why children and teenagers especially are often demotivated is that nothing in their life means anything. They know that most of what they're learning in school is either blue pill lies or it's completely useless and they will never use it as an adult. And they're sitting there going, I see adulthood coming towards me like I'm driving at a brick wall and nobody's teaching me how to survive this. And so they have a demotivation to go to school. They don't want to go.
And at 18, right, they're expected to know what they want to do for the rest of their life. And just a week before they graduate, they have to have permission to go to the bathroom.
Yeah.
They're only asked to figure it out in that small amount of time.
Many people have told me the only reason they went to university was because they didn't want to grow up yet, and this gave them 4 more years to be, you know, half a child, half an adult. It was a delay so they could stay in school longer, so they didn't have to take on full agency. You know, there could be somebody planning their life and telling them where they had to be and what they had to do. And there are a lot of people who cannot function if they do not have a job. You know, if they don't have a job to go to, they literally die. Many men die when they retire because for 40 years they've had someone telling them when to get up and when to be where and what they're going to do, and they can function under that. They retire and suddenly they have complete freedom, which is where agency really comes into its own. The more freedom you have, the more you're able to exercise your agency, and they're not used to it. They've become drones and they're unable to deal with that agency, and they have a heart attack and die afterwards from the anxiety of it all. And many men, they'll stay at work even if they're not really getting paid for it, because they could have retired at the same amount of money that they're working for, simply because they want someone to tell them what to do.
Yeah, they don't know themselves to where they know what their aspirations and desires are. So that's kind of like, I have all this free time, but I don't really know what to do with it.
Well, I think we mentioned too, we were talking about proxy agency. So where people, they seek out someone else that they feel has higher agency, and they say, could you exercise agency on my behalf, please? And sometimes it's not that formal, but a lot of that, if we look at the history of slavery, there were many people who said, I can't look after myself, and I will exchange food and shelter for all my services if you basically manage my life. So the low agency people is not some phenomenon of the 21st century, although it's perhaps the fact that we more than ever before need to have agency. In the past, if all you did for your life was to dig rows in the dirt and plant seeds, and that was your entire living, the amount of agency you have if you live in a highly agrarian, advanced society like in the Fertile Crescent, you don't need a lot of agency. You can be a peon and just do what you're told. Mm-hmm. And the harder life was, the higher level of agency you have. Well, today, employers do not need employees without agency. We don't need people to dig ditches. We have robots for that. We don't need people. We're not even going to need people to serve you food pretty soon. We're going to have robots for everything. Robots, by nature, have no agency. Mm-hmm. And anyone who has agency doesn't need to fear the coming automation. because they will be able to find things that they can do using their agency that continue to give them some sort of productive value. People of agency will always be in high demand. And the higher your agency, the higher the demand will be for you.
Absolutely. That's very much true.
That brings us to the next thing, which is as a parent, we need to help our kids discover what their desires are. We have to have that close, meaningful relationship with our kids so that we know what makes them tick, what they're passionate about, because through that avenue is how you teach them to have agency.
And we're not gonna really know that for a lot of children, because they've pair bonded and they're bonded with their peers rather than you as a parent.
Or they're bonded with the state because of their education. A lot of people a lot of young people associate more with the state than they do with their own parents. I mean, so far the state hasn't beaten them, and their parents have been, and so this could be part of it. But they spend most of their childhood at school, so of course they're gonna, they are in a state institution for at least 12 years, sometimes almost 2 decades. It's not unusual for them to have that bond with the state instead of their parents.
Oh, and then the school loads them down with hours and hours of homework, which puts them further away from the relationship of their parents.
Yes.
And this is why homeschooling is so imperative. Peaceful parenting, homeschooling. Mm-hmm. I mean, if you want somebody that is going to have agency and is going to have, because I think in the last video you did on agency, you talked about conscientiousness, right? One of the big 5 personality profiles. You're not going to have conscientiousness because that's tied into agency as well. And you're not going to have that if they're being told to do of every minute of every day. It's just not going to, it's just, they don't get practice.
Mm-hmm.
Well, in fact, there is a concerted effort on the part of many governmental institutions to reduce conscientiousness, because people who have low conscientiousness, they're not conscious of what needs to be done, and therefore they're always looking to a leader. And if you want to set yourself up as a dictatorial leader, you don't want people to question your authority. You don't want people to question your orders. Mm-hmm. In the military, they want the higher level soldiers, for example, the special forces, to have a lot of agency. The lower level, the bulk of the soldiers, though, they want them to suppress their agency so that they will cooperate and work for an authority. And that is changing with modern times. They're recognizing that more and more soldiers even need to have ability to manage themselves, because the modern battlefield is not so simple as here's a line of you guys and go walk into the fire of the other guys. If you want to tell someone to go walk towards someone who's shooting at him, if he has agency, he's going to go, that sounds like I'm going to die. I think I'll run the other way. And nowadays, though, it's a matter of, especially as we see traditional warfare becoming less effective, you have a half dozen guys with AK-47s in the hills of Afghanistan holding the entire U.S. military back because they decided that they weren't going to leave their caves. And so a few people with agency can make massive impacts. People that are willing to stick it out and follow through on their convictions can have massive impact on society. And this is why I say that, agency is, we're going to have a bull market in agency. It's going to be highly sought after and in high demand in the future. And the people who have agency have always been the ones that affected history the most, for good or for bad. And so we want to encourage our children to have agency, and as we mentioned earlier, moral agency as well.
Excellent.
Yeah, and I just want to mention that the homeschooling, the quality of the homeschooling matters, because you don't want to do what's done in an institution, bring the same methodology into your home. That's not homeschooling. And for people who don't know, I do Montessori homeschool, and we have our page, Peaceful Montessori Homeschooling, where we talk a lot about Montessori ways. And the reason I do Montessori is because it actually promotes children to have that independence early on. They get to have all of that practice that helps them build that agency. They get to make their own decisions. They get to do their own discovery. Their creativity, imagination just peaks. And so this is what Montessori does, and it's their methodology, their philosophy on giving children independence and getting all the skills to be the best individual they can be.
And we also have the YouTube channel, which you can locate our videos there. And of course our page, the Facebook page, and it's the Peaceful Montessori Homeschooling.
That's right.
And I'm also writing a novel on the fly. If you like a dystopic novel, it's really enjoyable for me to write. And it's put out about a chapter a week. If you're interested in that, I'm looking for a graphic artist to help with the illustrations, or maybe a full graphic novel. So anyway, I just wanted to throw that out too.
That's excellent. Yes, it's about time we wrap up. And if you're looking to develop your agency, either because you're a parent and you want to teach your children to have agency, follow their Montessori Peaceful Homeschooling group. We'll put a link below. And also, I have a course for agency, for the development of agency. And it teaches you how to reprogram your own mind to maximize the agency that you're capable of having. And this is good either for parents or for people who weren't raised in such a way that they developed agency. If you miss out on having a childhood that taught you to have agency, you have to now teach yourself. You have to be your own parent and look after yourself. And I really appreciate John and Adriana looking at that course and giving me a lot of feedback. Your feedback was really instrumental in polishing the edges on that course and adding some very important background information to the course. Thank you very much. And thank you very much also for joining us today.
I appreciate it. We're very honored to help you with that. It's an excellent program. I highly recommend it myself. I'm really excited that you're doing that. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Adriana and John. Have a great weekend. Bye-bye.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye.
If you are a parent and you'd like to know more about how to develop your agency and to teach your children, please go to www.smv4k.com or book a coaching session with me using the links below. If you realize that your parents never taught you agency, it's not too late to learn. I can help you to develop powerful levels of agency and willpower that will enable you to create a life that you love. I even have an entire course dedicated to helping you reprogram your mind and develop agency. Please go to smv4k.com or contact me by email at coach@noahravoy.com. Please help us spread this message by liking the video, sharing it, and subscribing to the channel. Thank you very much.